I'm Rama K. Ramaswamy, and I gave this talk at the Wellesley Free Library to highlight and promote reading Natalia Hull's book called Rocket Girls. And this was a talk that was very generously sponsored by the Wellesley Free Library and by the Friends of the Wellesley Free Library. And I wanted to, having said that, I wanted to also say that the Wellesley STEM Expo is coming up, and the date has been set for April 8, 2017 at the Wellesley High School. And it's an all-day, free to the public, hands-on science exploration chance for everybody, the whole community, seniors, kids, everyone, students. And it's all things science, tech, math, and engineering, so it's a must-go. And so for this purposes of this talk, for talking about women in science and space, I wanted to address three main postulates. So first, why is it important to study science? Why is science significant and important? Number two is, should we encourage women, and why should we encourage women or more people to go into STEM fields? And thirdly, what are the benefits and some of the challenges of going into STEM fields and pursuing science, tech, math, and engineering fields for careers? So the first slide that we had on our list is a Hubble Deep Field image that captures 10,000 galaxies or more. So for all those people who ask the question, are we alone out there, and are we the first or the only Goldilocks planet? Well, here's our chance to explore 10,000 other galaxies that might potentially hold life. And this is not the first of NASA's works or photos or taken through Hubble, but in '73, actually, NASA launched one of their first probes, and I think it was one of the first Voyager series probes. And it captured thousands of pictures of Jupiter and Mars and other planets that were then streamed back to Earth for people to see. And they actually put it on TV, and the public was so overwhelmed and curious and happy to see these pictures that NASA was actually nominated for an Emmy for their 1973 documentary on images, the first images from space. It certainly never dulls the human imagination to see all these photos.
Do you think those images were kind of like the first stepping stone into space exploration, a little bit more in depth?
It could be. I think people have, since the dawn of history and written history, human beings have always been fascinated by looking up at the stars and looking up at space. There's so many cultures dating to BC era where people have charted astronomy and looked at the stars and tried to make calendars and postulates, right? So it's something that's always fascinated mankind, humankind.
And you think that the technology was kind of there at that point in the 70s that we were able to kind of take that next step forward?
Right. I think a lot of space exploration, modern space exploration as we know it, was started off as a competition between the former Soviet Union and the United States. And the U.S. government really wanted to keep up with that. They couldn't have the former Soviet Union dominate space, after all.
Yeah.
So I think that really set it off. And from the beginning, regarding space exploration, they always talked about and discussed the possibility of women going up into space, because they said, well, women eat less, they're lighter, they're smaller, they're more agile, and for many other reasons. But it really wasn't until Sputnik hit that the American government really took it seriously.
Why is that? Or why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's interesting. For the women angle, I think it's hard to do something you've never done before. And it's also a societal, psychological change that's progressively happened since then to now, where women are really in all the fields that men once traditionally exclusively occupied, and no less for space. It's interesting that I think when Kennedy announced that they were going to have an initiative to put the first man on the moon, it was a team of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and they went up and they landed on the moon. I think it was somewhere 63, 64. And so that initiative. But before then, they had several probes that they launched, because they didn't know what they would find. They didn't know what would happen. And it was risky to put human beings in a capsule and send them up into a hostile environment where there's no oxygen. But since that first moon landing, it was not till 1983 where the first woman went into space, and that was Sally Ride. I think that in '78, NASA came up with a group of 35 recruits, and there's a large photo. And the women in that group are highlighted by squares. And there were 6 women. And there were, I think there were Sally Ride, Catherine Sullivan, I think from left to right. It's Sally Ride, Catherine Sullivan, Judith Resnick, Anna Fisher, Shannon Lucid, and Margaret Rhea Seddon. And Margaret Seddon actually is very interesting. There was a physician who had conducted tests on behalf of NASA and male test pilots to see what kind of rigor they could endure. And he conducted, not funded by NASA, but separate tests on a group of women that he recruited. And it turned out that the women beat the men like 10 to 1 on practically every test that he gave them. And these are pretty arduous sort of tests. It's not the usual thing. Like, for example, one of the tests was to pour freezing water into the inner ear for 25 seconds or something, and see how long you could tolerate that and how long it would take you to regain your composure and bearings. So the condition was that you had to be a pilot in the U.S. military. You had to be a test pilot. And none of the women were test pilots because they didn't allow women in the military. So sort of a catch-22. Nonetheless, the women that this physician recruited beat the men 10 to 1 on every single thing. And this one, Margaret Seddon, was actually, she outdid the men by 10 hours or so. It was not just a small leap. It was a phenomenal time that she exceeded the expectations. She was in an underwater tank for something like I don't know, more than 24 hours or something, and she outdid the men by 10 hours sitting in that tank, able to have her composure and do math. And I think in 1978 it was pretty astonishing, and I think that women like Geraldine Cobb, who was a award-winning pilot, and she was part of the Mercury 13 astronaut selection process, where she endured some of these tests that we just spoke about. But she was never allowed to go into space. It was the men who were always sent on the missions. So the first woman in space, again, the credit goes to the Russians with Valentina Tereshkova in '63. And that was really the first time that NASA and the U.S. government decided, well, it can be done, because it was done by the Russians. So women can go into space. Imagine in the 60s and 70s, when people would have seen this very slender, young, good-looking woman who could have been an easy poster model, but she's actually sitting in mission control wearing a headset and calculating trajectories for the return of rockets, and astronauts coming back to Earth and going to the moon and slingshotting around and all these fun things that seem so complicated to do. She's calculating all these things by hand before they had computers. And I just think of the stir that must have caused when people saw her on TV or on posters, and the caption was always, Frances Northcutt, Poppy Northcutt keeps bringing astronauts home. Very inspirational. And I think that paved the way for a lot of women to pursue STEM fields, and especially try to go into NASA. So women started saying, well, we can be astronauts too. We can work in mission control. And there was a lot of pressure. She bore a huge burden, because she always, and she talks about it still when she's interviewed, that she couldn't afford to make any mistakes, because if she was seen to or viewed to be any less than perfect, they may not allow other women to pursue such dreams in the same fields.
So tell me about what is mission control?
So it's the mothership where you sit and you figure out what happens when a capsule with astronauts go around the dark side of the moon and then lose radio contact. And then you have to figure out the precise window at which they're going to enter out of the dark side, and when they reestablish radio control, and when they can actually initiate their descent back to Earth. And there's a particular window. It's not like you can just do it anytime. And so you have to calculate how that's going to happen, how they should tilt the capsule, what angle they should come in, course corrections if they get knocked off course, all those things. I think Poppy Northcutt really paved the path, and she was really the first. And there were a couple of others as well, but they always put her up on all the visuals and the posters. And I think she just looked so great with that headset, right?
Yeah.
That must have been it.
Very, very good.
But she actually was interesting because she did say that every night she would take all the book of calculations. It was like a thick, thick book. And she would take that home every night and she would rework all the calculations. She would rework them backwards and forwards. And the entire mission model, all the numbers that it required from all the way from launch from Earth to re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. She reworked all those numbers so well that at one point she was the only person who knew that program backwards and forwards and in her sleep. So not just gender, but beyond gender, it's really the consistent iteration and the time that she put into learning every single piece of equipment, program, software, the computer models, all of it, that she knew so well. She's demonstrating not only to her fellow mission control colleagues, who are all men, but also for the TV crew that came in that day to see how she does what she does. She's demonstrating her calculations, and that's actually part of her trajectory model that she's writing on the chalkboard there to show how the Apollo 8 mission was going to slingshot around the moon and come back to Earth. They didn't actually land, but they had an explosion on board and they had some difficulties, so she had to figure out how to get them home in one piece. I think that since she was the first, and she says in her interviews, she says that she would have preferred to have been the 20th or the 30th woman to have been featured in Mission Control, but she was the first. And so the TV cameras love to go in there and watch her doing equations on the on the chalkboard of math equations. Yes, and all those differential equations and trajectory calculations she has up there. They were just fascinated that she could whip all this out on the chalkboard. And
she's a woman too.
And exactly why. And so they were fascinated with the concept that she could do that and be so confident, and it's so easy for her. And actually, for one of the later Apollo missions, I think Apollo 13. When Poppy was no longer, I think she had retired from NASA, but they brought her back. She had flown out to Florida to watch the takeoff, the launch, and then she was on her way home, and then she was recalled because she was the only person who knew that onboard system that the Apollo mission was using, and they had an onboard oxygen explosion, and so they had some difficulty getting back. And I think there's a Tom Hanks movie that was made about that Apollo 13 mission. So that was her mission, where she came back into mission control and she helped sort it out and get those people home safely. So that's a photo, and there's a photo of all those women who were the first pioneering women who were actually called computresses. They were human computers. And it was just that the computer was just taking off, but it was very rudimentary, and so these were the women who did all those calculations by hand. The women were something special and unusual because there were so few of them. Okay. So that picture was actually one of the photos that Natalia Holt uses for her book, The Rocket Girls, The Rise of the Rocket Girls. And that's one of the earliest pictures. And one of the people right in the front is Susan Finley, who, and there's a couple of photos on the slides of Susan. Susan, when she the year before she joined NASA, before NASA was actually founded as NASA, she was already there working in this area, and then a picture of her taken in 2015, and she's had the longest career in NASA, something like 55 years. She's been there, and there's not one project that she has not worked on in some way throughout that entire time. And it's interesting that recently her title was engineer, and she was demoted to technical staff because she doesn't have a college degree. And so she's been there for so long that the policy of NASA has changed, where you now are required to have a degree or two in order to hold certain positions or titles. But in an interview, Susan Finley said, well, she doesn't really mind because she still gets to work on what she wants to work on. So. And she has a very interesting field. She actually is, she works on the parabolic dishes and detecting signals from outer space. So one of my favorite movies was with Jodie Foster, Contact. And it's really, part of that, I think, really mirrors Susan Finley's work and life. And I'm sure Hollywood has its own way with, facts and making it seem much more appealing and glamorous. But it really does mirror Susan Finley's life, because she actually started when there were no dishes, and she's been obsessed with tracing signals from outer space. And recently she was one of the key people who launched the Juno probe that took something like 7 to 9 years to reach its destination. And it'll continue to take photographs, and it'll measure not only the magnetic field, when I hear that it has a very intense magnetic field, but I'm sorry, Jupiter. I say Juno. The probe is called Juno. It's Jupiter. So, and it has a very intense magnetic field and atmospheric measurements, and it also takes thousands of photos of the planet. So that's Susan Finley's work. And now I believe there are several dishes. The first one was in Goldstone Observatory in California in the Mojave Desert. And now there's one in Australia, Spain, and that have joined that network. And she actually wrote the software, I believe, that links those stations together, so that those stations can maintain communications with the probe that's launched in outer space, no matter the which robotic explorer is sent, no matter the rotation of our planet or the spacecraft's rotation. Regardless, it'll still deliver a signal, and the signal will be picked up by these DSN dishes. So, and the signal, it's really interesting. I found out that the emission of that signal is 20 billion times weaker than a digital watch, and that's what they're listening for. Right, so that's Sally Ride, first woman in space. So anytime you're the first to do something, you feel like you're bearing an enormous burden to pave the way. So it's sort of extra pressure to be perfect and do it well. So Sally Ride, when we think of the first American woman in space, Sally Ride is usually credited with that. That is the Juno probe that Susan Finley worked on. Okay. And that will measure a variety of things from Jupiter. It's the magnetosphere of the planet. And within that, they have very sophisticated technologies. They have what's called a JEDI chip. And JEDI stands for Jupiter Energetic Particle Detector Instrument. And it's a cutting-edge instrument that'll measure the composition of the immense magnetic system surrounding the planet, as I said, and also make measurements about the atmosphere and the gravitational fields that surround the planet. So it gives us more in-depth information about the origin and the formation of the solar system, not only that particular planet, but a lot of other general information. And and NASA's always been on the cutting edge of making technology. So in a sense, it was really interesting for me to find out when I read that it was easier for the Soviets to put a human into space than it was for the Americans, because the Americans' technology had so far outstripped depending on human beings to fulfill that requirement or component, that they had to almost reverse engineer themselves backwards in order to make a space capsule that would be habitable by 3 humans and send them out there. And in that same trait, in that keeping along those same lines, these chips that they've developed, they're actually called specific integrated circuits, or ASIC chips, and they're designed to measure particles in space. They're very small. They're resistant to radiation hazards, and for satellite computers, and they play a crucial role in the instrumentation inside that Juno probe that was just sent out. So spacecrafts that are sent out, probes that are sent out, are subject to so much radiation bombardment. It's a hostile environment even for computers, not just for humans. Yeah. So these are a new age, new gen type of system, and they're small, they're durable, and they're functionable. I mean, they'll work almost forever. Yeah. They never run out. So all the planets are very interesting in our solar system, and they're going to have a series of things that they're going to do. They have all kinds of measurements that they have set up, samples. How does it compare to the other planets? Right. Is there a possibility of life? Was there a life before? So a lot of times, geoscientists will postulate and recalculate paleo environments, or environments that existed in the past, based on modern processes that we see happening today. And one of the major fields of study is the field of extreme environments and geomicrobiology that's cropped up in the last 20 years. And part of my PhD thesis research was studying extreme environments, and especially in acid mine drainage areas. And the reason I like those environments was because if life could exist on Earth in those kinds of environments, then there's a good chance that you might find life in other planets existing elsewhere. So you can make postulates about the type of conditions that extreme environments hold for life. And it would further help to create technologies and availability of instrumentation to measure potential life systems in those different kinds of extreme environments. I worked in an acid mine system in south central Virginia where the river was yellow, and the pH was somewhere between 2 and 3.5 at any given time. So that's like, imagine a river of lemonade, or without the added water and the sugar. It's just lemon juice. It's a very, very acidic environment. And there were a whole complex series of algae and bacteria that thrived there. It's almost they had no competition from the other species that live in higher pH environments or more reasonable and tolerable environments. So they outcompeted all the other species. And it's actually, the town is called Mineral Virginia. Because that area gives off so many, provides so much heavy metals, gold, silver. Actually, the United States sulfuric acid needs for the World War II effort were largely sustained by mining in this area. This area produced something like 80% of the country's sulfuric acid needs during that time. So the runoff, there's a lake that it drains into, and so every time there's a storm, there's a lot of fish that end up dying and landing on the shoals of the beaches along the sides of the lake, because there's an acid pulse, and it also contains a heavy metal pulse, and so it's toxic and poisonous and inhospitable to most of the normal aquatic ecosystems that exist in a pH of 7 or around thereabouts, neutral. And so if you can find life on Earth that can sustain itself on something other than what we're used to, phosphate, then there must be life on other planets that could potentially do the same and still be qualified as life. So in Mars, for example, there is ice, and they find evidence of what they think was once a large superficial ocean. So now scientists are getting very excited about potentially building a machine that they can drop off on the surface of Mars that'll generate oxygen, so that future missions can land there and they can get their oxygen supply from the surface of that planet rather than having to carry it from Earth. So things like that. So these are the kinds of applications that we're looking at. Elon Musk is a very interesting man because he has quite a few different things he'd like to do. He'd like to invent a transporter system like on Star Trek on Earth, so you can just beam yourself around the planet. So that's one. And then the other one, of course, is the colonization of Mars. So he is very visionary and ambitious in what he wants to do. And I hope that he achieves that in my lifetime so I can try it out. Because I would love to do that. It comes back to the three postulates I talked about in the beginning of my talk, and I think that science is significant because it's really the one field of study that answers or asks the question why. You have so many other fields that ask so many other questions, but science really gets to the heart of why. Why does this happen? Why is it that way? What makes it tick? Why does it do that? And it's important because science really drives the world forward. Without science, we wouldn't have many of the basic requirements that we all have come to rely on, like running water. And I think that we should encourage all people, especially women, but all people, to go into science, because the recent census poll for the United States says that the percentage of women in the United States is something like 50.6% of the total population. So that's if you don't have women in science, you're only utilizing essentially less than half of your potential in the country. And the more people you have, the more brains you have working together to drive humanity forward. That's a win-win for everybody, right? So, and of course there are benefits and there are challenges. Many of the women astronauts that we saw in that 1978 NASA photo talk about all the challenges that they had to face, but they also talk about how their kids and grandkids now look up to them and are considering dressing up as a NASA mission control officer for Halloween. It's just in their mental ethos that they want to try to do this. And of course, the benefits are, I think I've already mentioned some of the benefits. So I read a recent survey where they said that among all the professions that traditionally that traditionally belong to men or that traditionally men go into, men dominate those fields still. But the professions that women traditionally go into, those fields have a 50-50 rate of dominance, gender-based dominance for women. So it's interesting that that split. Although there are a lot of women in the workforce, more than there ever were in the 20s, 30s, 40s, or 50s, that they're still not, certain fields are still not completely dominated by women in those areas. There are some fields like biomedical research, statistics, analytics. There are things like that there are more women than historically were present. And I think that there are also the men to women ratio is pretty, it's 50-50 in those fields, but rising for women. So, and there are other fields like I think engineering is a field where women don't find it that easy to build their numbers. I consider myself to be pretty modern, and I was in college doing a lot of science classes, and I was usually always maybe one of 5 women in most of my classes, and I took a lot of science courses. So
yeah.
You're
kind of like your own pioneer.
I in my own mind.
It's good to think that.
Yeah, it's good to think that.
It's very motivational.
It's a motivational win-win every day.
Where do we go from here, though?
Right. I think it's getting. I think that it's a good time to be. I think 2016 is a good year for women, and I think it's getting better as we progress. So check with me in about 20 years, and we'll reevaluate those stats.